evening, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Green Table Talk. Tonight's focus is lead poisoning and the mental health crisis. This show is hosted by Black Millennials for Flint. My name is Kayla Shannon. I am a junior at the illustrious Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia, an advocate for Flint, Michigan, and your host. I'm so glad to be before you tonight, joined by another amazing panel. I'm really looking forward to tonight's discussion. But before we get started and I pass it over to them, I'd like to recognize our partners. So shout out to the Environmental Defense Fund and the Climate Action Campaign for supporting our ability to have such important conversations. So let's hop right in. A study published by the JAMA Psychiatry Journal shows that early exposure to lead, which can be found in the paint and dust of old homes and even in local water supplies, is associated with increased mental illness in adulthood, including phobia, depression, mania, and schizophrenia. As May is Mental Health Awareness Month, tonight's panel features the intersection between mental health experts, environmental justice advocates, public servants, community organizers, and policy strategists who work to uplift brown communities. Beginning right here with Elise, please introduce yourself and then pass it on down to another dope panelist.
All right, well, thank you for having me here. I am Elise Tolbert. I am an environmental justice practitioner and public health advocate. I currently work at the Union of Concerned Scientists on federal energy policy and state and regional energy policy, and also am the founder and executive director of Next Step Up, which is a nonprofit that provides free mentoring and tutoring to local high school students in Tuskegee, Alabama. I'm the co-founder of the Macon County Youth Council, which is empowering young people in Macon County and throughout Alabama to engage in our civic affairs of the county and of the state. And I'm excited to be here with you all today.
Thank you. Dr. Bailey.
Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Reverend Dr. Sarah Bailey, and I am from Flint, Michigan. And I'm here representing so many different organizations in Flint. I'm with the Flint Public Health Youth Academy as their administrator. I have another nonprofit organization called Bridges into the Future, and I'm the CEO of that organization. I'm with the community-based organization Partners, which is a long-standing grassroots community organizing group. I am also with a lot of other different groups, including including the Flint Task Force on Coronavirus, as well as I am also the co-lead for the Michigan Institute for Clinical Research. So I'm with a lot of different organizations, and all of it has to do with the intersection of the environment, public health, and technology.
Thank you.
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Lauren, and hello to my other panelists here. My name is Lauren Owan, and I am a Black Millennials for Flint lead ambassador, as well as their former EJ director. I also work in environmental justice advocacy and community work outreach. I consider myself a Pan-African activist, and working in different organizations just to amplify and bring information to community sources. So that's where I am.
Thank you. So we have a panel full of experts, y'all, and we're going to get right into today's discussion. On April 12, 2015, Freddie Carlos Gray Jr., a 25-year-old African-American, was arrested by the Baltimore Police Department over what former prosecutor Marilyn Mosby claimed was his legal possession of a knife. While in police custody, Gray sustained fatal injuries and was taken to the R. Adams Cowley Shock Trauma Center. Gray died on April 19, 2015. His death was ascribed to injuries to his cervical spinal cord. Prior to Freddie Gray's unfortunate death, he experienced childhood lead poisoning, which left him with lifelong cognitive development and mental health challenges. Also, prior to Corinne Gaines' murder, also by Baltimore police, she was in an open lawsuit against a former landlord as she too experienced lead poisoning. Lauren, you've been blessed to have a relationship with the Gaines family. In your opinion, why do you think it's important for law enforcement to better understand and recognize the impacts of lead poisoning and lead exposure on mental health issues demonstrated in their communities?
Thank you so much for that question, Kayla. You're right. I have been blessed to have a relationship with the Gaines family and learn more about the effects of lead poisoning, not just on Corinne herself, but just overall in the community of Baltimore. And Freddie Gay and Corinne are just examples of what lead poisoning can do to someone introduced from childhood into adulthood. So one of the things that I really want law enforcement to understand, or what should be understood, is those mental health effects that come with early childhood lead prevention and lead poisoning, and how that affects the behaviors of our youth. So with lead, even 1 millimeter within your blood can have effects on your behavior, effects on your mental health, where you can have learning disabilities. And so historically, African Americans within our communities, we have been classified within our education systems. As soon as we have a behavior problem, as soon as some mental health issue comes out, they're criminalized. And so one of the things I really implore our law enforcement to do is to take a different lens when we see these behaviors, because cities like Baltimore, cities like Flint, cities like even Jackson, Mississippi, where there's environmental issues, they can lead to long-term effects that, yes, the behavior may not be what we want, but there should be a different lens to just put them in jail, put them in juvenile, arrest them, throw them in, look at them as criminals, when these are actual children that have been affected by, let's call it, white supremacy. So I think just having that type of knowledge base when dealing with certain issues would prevent a lot of the killings that have been going on.
Yes, that's really important. And I think what you're explaining is like a broader lens and perspective of the human experience, right? Mm-hmm. That so often these police officers look at a person and they see the outcome, right? They mm-hmm. see the behavior that is manifested, but they're not looking to recognize all of the different environmental factors that impact the current situation, right? Yeah. There's so much that leads a person to these adverse behaviors mm-hmm. that have to be recognized and taken into account. We can't just punish the symptom of the problem without exactly. going back to recognize what's actually causing the issue at the root level. Absolutely. So to Elise and Dr. Bailey, from a public health and environmental perspective, which broadens that lens, how does lead exposure impact mental health? And what have been some specific examples that you've seen in your field?
Oh, I can take that. When we look at lead poisoning or lead consumption, we have to go further back than the recent water crisis in Flint, which occurred in 2014. We need to go all the way back and look at how lead has been introduced into our community, to our environment over time. Mm-hmm. The different kinds of ways that lead came in, through paint, through dishes and glasses, and all of those things that we made using lead. And for Flint, the issue was that the cystines and the pipes that are underneath that you cannot see, all of them were made with lead, but they were coated so that the lead would not be able to leach into the water. And when that coating was eroded for failure to provide it, it caused the lead in those pipes to leach into the water. So how does it affect that? That's the public health end of it. So it got into the drinking water for an entire community because someone thought that it was easier to not pay $100, a month for the corrosive, non-corrosives to be added to the water, as opposed to putting those in and keeping those pipes safe. And how does it affect people's behavior? because red is a neurotoxin. What it does is that it affects the brain. It affects the medulla of the brain. It affects the frontal lobe. And when you're talking about affecting the frontal lobe of the brain, especially in developing children, that's the place where we learn to control our actions and we learn to control our behavior. And when you impact that and cause that to be damaged, then what happens is that we don't have that impulse control. We don't have that damage control. So if I step on your foot and I'm supposed to just tell you, ouch, you stepped on my foot, and allow you time to say you're sorry, you stepped on my foot and I'm immediately into an aggressive situation. And we notice that when many people are functioning under lead poisoning, they become a little bit more aggressive. We knew that in the 60s when we looked at lead coming from into communities from leaded gas going as people travel through those communities. And when we took the lead out of gasoline and you looked at those communities, you found that the violence in those communities lowered. So we know that there's a correlation. It's not like these are things that we don't know. We know these things. So what is our responsibility? If I know that, then I have a responsibility to deal with that and to ensure that that does not happen to anyone, much less an entire community. And there are multiple communities in the United States that are impacted by lead in the environment, in our communities, and it creates a public health crisis because then we have to try to figure out how are we going to cope with the aftermath, the violence, you know, the kids getting arrested. How do we cope with that? What do we do?
Yeah, just to add on to Dr. Bailey's point, children are sensitive to lead exposure because it impacts their brain and their neurological system. But something that we don't often think about when we talk about lead poisoning is how it impacts people over their lifetime. And this really phenomenal study that was done in New Zealand looked at the levels of lead in children when they're about 3 to 10 years old, at a time in which the action level of lead was much higher. It was around 50 micrograms per deciliter of blood, and found elevated levels of lead in their blood, and then studied these people for over 30 years. And what's novel about this study is that, one, it studied them for 30 years, so it's the longest study, but it was also the largest study, so it studied almost 600 people, and found a number of mental illnesses in those people. Now, this is not causation, but it is association. There was an association between schizophrenia, between phobia and anxiety in the population of people who had elevated levels of lead later in life. And that's really important because even though we don't have causation, just the association, knowing that at a time lead was so ubiquitous in the environment and it does not degrade easily, so it's still very ubiquitous in the environment. When we experience, we're in a time of increased violence, experiencing mass shootings or experiencing people acting out or getting angry, we really do need a public health approach to dealing with mental health, because the impacts of lead impact every organ in the body, every organ system, including our brain and our mental health. But the impacts are irreversible, but that means then we have to consider how we'll plan for a society that has been poisoned by lead. Yeah. And it's also really sad because, as Dr. Bailey pointed out before, communities of color, and particularly Black communities, are overly burdened by lead poisoning, increased lead exposure. And you would say, why? Is it just because they're Black? No, it's not because we're Black that people are just burdened by elevated levels of exposure to lead. It's because of systematic disinvestment in Black and brown communities. Houses that were built before 1978, before lead was banned from paint, are some of the older houses, and because of banking practices and because of HUD voucher practices and so many other practices. Those are the houses in which lower income people, of which Black people make up a higher percentage of lower income people, are relegated to living in. And so then we're exposed to the lead chips and the lead dust from the paint. And it's really sad. There's this one case in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, just to add on to this adulthood exposure. There's this one case in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where the community had high levels of lead amongst hundreds of children in that community. And there's this one person who was interviewed, he and his mother. This guy had levels 10 times the action level for blood lead. He was tested by the age of 2, and now he's 20. He never graduated high school, has not been able to hold a job, and he said that his mind has been messed up. He's been messed up in the head. And when you think about a person who never got to experience their best self, in a sense, or like live their best life, not because of their own choices, not because they didn't want to pull themselves up by the bootstraps, but because they were poisoned by an environmental chemical beyond their control, it's really sad, especially because it is totally preventable. But yeah, those are some specific examples of how it impacts mental health and how it impacts real people's lives on the ground too.
Yes. So much sticks out for me in what you all said, but I think the common thread is like all of the fallout, right? Like we talk about the context, and what I appreciate is the time conceptualization, right? That you take this back decades, right? This isn't something that like occurs overnight. And then when you talk about passing things down generationally, right? The things that occur genetically when you have experienced lead poisoning and then you go to have children. First of all, the way that it impacts even your ability to continue to have children. And I think something you said, Elise, is that like, it's not because we're Black, right? It's not because it's not because people are Black that they're experiencing lead poisoning at higher rates. And in the literal sense, it's not, right? But contextually, it is because we're Black. Right?
Okay, contextually.
You know, like, and I just mean that to say that like the system was built in such a way so that Black and brown people did not have access or were exposed, and there was less of a care about the exposure. There was less of a desire for intervention in Black and brown communities. So I so appreciate that context, right? And once again, like the greater issues that not only is this something that has been occurring, as you said, over decades, right? Not only is it something that disproportionately impacts Black and brown communities, as so many of the ills of our system do, but in addition to that, there's fallout for the rest of, like, it has implications on the rest of your life. In almost every area of your quality of living, there's some sort of impact of this lead poisoning, which is why it's so important for us to have these conversations.
Right.
So lead poisoning, as you all sort of spoke to, has a direct correlation to occurrences of violent crime. Cities that use lead pipes have homicide rates 24% higher than in cities without lead pipes. The lead crime hypothesis is that, 1, lead exposure at young ages leaves children with problems like learning disabilities, ADHD, and impulse control problems. And 2, those problems cause them to commit crime as adults, particularly violent crime. For example, Nakia Wakes, a mother in Flint, shared that while her son was diagnosed with ADHD prior to lead exposure, he now has additional special needs and has developed serious behavioral issues, leading him to get suspended from school more than 50 times. And when we talk about the systemic things set up in the school system, being suspended that many times, when we think about the school to prison pipeline, the implications of lead poisoning and increased aggression on communities that already suffer from disciplinary issues, right? So Dr. Bailey, for you, can you share examples of how the Flint water crisis has specifically impacted the mental health and development of youth and young adults? and also what you have found to be a successful investment strategies to best address those issues.
Yes. In Flint, I suppose one of the biggest things that I saw back during the beginning of the water crisis was the fact that many of the children had a fear because of what was being reported on the news. Now, it needed to be reported, but you have to do things in a way that it doesn't really cause the community to become fearful, but cause the community to want to be brought to action. And with young people, if you do not explain to them the fullness of what's going on, then what they do is they end up being extremely fearful. And because these young people were fearful, they thought that they were going to die. And not only did they think that they were going to die, they didn't think that they had a reason to continue to work towards any type of goals or anything, because I'm going to die anyway, so what difference does it make? So you get to that point where people give up, especially young people, very young children that are giving up on life before life even begins for them. At ages 7 and 8 and 9 years old, they're already saying, I'm done for, I'm going to die anyway. So that was one of the things that I saw in the beginning, and I knew at that point that we had to do something to change that narrative. That had to be changed, and that's the responsibility of the community. And I know a lot of people think that the folks in Flint was just sitting back and kind of letting this thing happen. We did not have the control over what happened to us there. I think we have to continuously remind people that it was a loss of democracy there, that was taken away from us by the state, that a Republican state, I'm sorry y'all, but it was a Republican governor who took that away from the people in this blue city, predominantly black democratic city, that actually took away our democracy. And when our democracy was taken away, it created and caused all of these issues that now you left to the community to have to resolve with no funds, no money, no help, no nothing. So one of the things that we decided to do was to run a summer camp for the kids and say, we're going to bring these kids to camp and we're going to tell these kids that they are beautiful, they are young, that they are gifted, that they can learn, that they're going to, and so we started this with a summer camp. And it was basically to expose them to life is still good. Even though we got to go through this, your life is still worth something. It is still good. You can still have fun. You can still learn. And I had kids that had already been diagnosed as having ADHD. That kids were already being on the autism spectrum because it does affect their ability to focus and to actually stay focused on different tasks and issues, and the more you try to confine them, the worse it gets. So one of the things that we did is we brought in some youth that were already going on to college or at that point that they could become mentors to these kids. We brought in about 85 of them and took them through a whole summer of just lots of love and attention. And since then, we have run a summer camp every year. And so that's how we met Black Millennials for Flint, because we were doing a summer camp in relation to public health, because we think our children ought to know what happened. What did I do? I ran a program in Flint right shortly after that says, know what's in your water. You have a right to know what's in your water. I now still continue to work with different researchers to run another program where you test your own water and make yourself feel good about whether or not your water is worthy, you know, whether or not there's lead or anything, because I know once trust is broken, it's hard for you to get it back. And so why would people in Flint trust anybody telling them that the water is okay? They, you know, I love my president. I do. I really did. I love my President Obama. But he came to Flint and he drank the water that never went into the homes of the people. So the water he was drinking was okay, but the water that traveled through the pipes to the homes, to the people, it was not okay. And those people knew it because they could see the water when it came out, the color it was, the smell that it had, and what it tastes like. So these people don't trust folks. You can come there with all your wonderful ideas and everything, but they don't trust you.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you get them to trust again? If you don't trust me, trust yourself. So let me teach you how to actually test your own water so that you can trust yourself, so that you can trust the water again. So those are some of the things that we've been doing. We've been working with youth to have them understand that they can make decisions in the city, and that they have a lot of the ills of the city, they already have the solutions to. We just have to listen to them, and that's what we've been doing, some of the things we've been doing.
Yes, thank you. And first of all, I have to give her flowers,
Right.
because Dr. Bailey is one of the folks that helped to introduce me to public health in the first place, and a large part of the reason why I even have the platform that I do have. And to speak to my experience with the Flint Public Health Youth Academy, of which I am an intern for the 3rd year now, it's important that we recognize that, first of all, that the Flint water crisis was occurring much before it ever hit the news cycle, right? And that it's continuing to impact the lives of folks. First of all, there are still people in the city of Flint that don't have clean drinking water. But even those who do have clean drinking water now are still suffering from the impact of this almost decade-long crisis that's been occurring in the city of Flint, right? And you talk about that compounded by the violence that youth were already facing in the city, right? Flint has a long history of neglect from the state of Michigan, right? Back to even when it was booming with industry, to the white flight, to the segregation and the redlining that happened within and throughout the state of Michigan, right? And so it's important for us to recognize that, like, lead poisoning was almost like the last block to pull out of the Jenga that was already deconstructing itself over decades in time, right? And what I love about the Flint Public Health Youth Academy, and what I love about working with the group, is that it empowers youth to say that, like, at one point they said that the water crisis was a death sentence, right? Yeah. Like they looked at the city of Flint, and it almost became what the city was, right? And it's so important that we recognize that, like, there are warriors living in that city, and not by choice, but they've been forced to have to be warriors, right? But I love that what the Flint Public Health Youth Academy does is that it takes this lens of, like, yes, this is what has torn us apart, but now you have the ability and the capability to now diagnose these issues before they happen, and not only to diagnose them, but then to take steps towards progress for your community and communities similar. So that's extremely important, this idea of empowering folks that have been impacted by lead poisoning to say, like, this isn't your story, right? That although you couldn't control what happens to you, you can continue to control your narrative and the decisions that you take from here. To Elise and Lauren, as a follow-up to what Dr. Bailey described as far as the impact of lead poisoning in the city of Flint specifically, I want to talk about how a team of researchers at Wayne State University discovered that mothers with high levels of lead in their blood not only affect the fetal cells of their unborn children, but also their grandchildren. Knowing the generational impacts of lead exposure, why is it so important for communities to be educated on lead poisoning prevention?
I could start if you would like me to. So there's a study that has shown that there are over 3,000 census tracts in America with levels of lead double the levels of lead in Flint, and over 300 counties with levels of lead that are over the levels of lead, double the levels of lead exposure in Flint. And when we think about how endemic lead exposure is in this country, across the country, and about the fact that there are so many places in which people don't even know or realize that they're being exposed to lead, and couple that with the generational impact of lead. Lead is so unique in that it competes with calcium in your body. So it can be stored in the bone, it can cross the blood-brain barrier, and it can cross into the placenta. It can also be transferred from a mother to a child through breast milk. And so, you know, I think about this concept of generational wealth all the time, how we're talking about leaving our children with something better than what we have, or storing up good things for generations to come. And when we think about lead and the fact that we can pass that on to our children and to our grandchildren, this is a story of generational detriment. Who wants to give generational detriment? And it's generational detriment on a large scale, because we know that there are thousands of communities across this country and then across the world, but thousands across this country who will be exposed to lead. And what's cool about this, though, is that we have for a long time had prevention strategies. So it's important that families know, it's important that local officials know, it's important that our state officials and our federal officials know, because once we know, then we can act. So if people understand in their house that my house was built before a certain time, it probably has lead paint, it can change their cleaning habits and their cleaning actions such that their children aren't exposed. If county commissioners and local public health agencies and mayors know we want to protect our population, we need to start testing all children for lead exposure at a young age, they can do that. If our federal government knows, which it does know and has known for a very long time, even society has known even since like the ancient Roman times that lead can cause issues. We have great painters who had mental health issues because they were painted with lead paint, that it causes an issue, then we can employ a federal public health strategy against lead, which this Biden-Harris administration has done and has put some money behind. But it's important that people know so that it can guide their actions. I think that's the most important reason for people to know.
Yes, absolutely, and I agree with everything that you said. And just adding to that, lead, like you said, lead has been an issue for decades and generation upon generation. But as we've been talking and giving off status, I've seen people in the audience like, what? Like, oh my gosh, oh my goodness. Every single time I have a conversation with anyone about lead, they're like, I had no idea, I didn't know, oh my goodness, it's in my house, it's in my water, so there is a lack of knowledge. With the lack of knowledge comes a lack of empowerment. And so one of the things that is very important is not just the advocacy, not just the education, but the accountability. Because there are people who know what's going on. We can look at Flint, we can look at Jackson, Mississippi right now. People know that these things are going on, but because the communities that it's affecting are not the ones that we see in those, normally we see them in their, local council members. They're not going to be on Federal Hill. They're not going to be, taking these politicians to task, right? Because they're concerned about their survival. Because they're put into an environment where that's what their concern is. And people in higher places know that. They know these things, and so it takes, organizations like Black Millennials for Flint, public health advocates such as yourself on this panel, a younger generation that just comes in and brings that accountability piece, because we have all the knowledge, we have all the resources, we can quote all the statistics, we can quote all the scenarios, but at the end of the day, the people that have the actual wherewithal to correct these pipes, to correct where this lead is coming from, to correct the paint, to give out grants for people to fix their homes. That is where the accountability piece comes in, where we have the funding, but why is it that people don't know about it? Or why, if you have, $300,000, but only $2,000 have been used, where did the other money go? So those are the type of conversations that we need to start having as far as, again, education is great, but accountability to these higher ups, people who are in charge of public works, of our water, of our housing, they're the ones that need to be held accountable on a more fierce level than what they have been.
Thank you. And may I just add something in? I really appreciate what you said about accountability and what you said before about this actually being because we're Black. And there's an example that I think is I'm sure you could quote this example, a very a good example of public officials making different choices for different colors of people. Dr. Bullard had the book, The Right Complexion for Protection.
Okay.
In East Chicago, Indiana, there was a West Calumet housing complex that is just probably one of America's grossest, most gross case scenarios of lead poisoning. This housing complex was built on a Superfund site, and residents found out many years later that they had lead levels over 228 times the maximum contaminant level. Our former Vice President, Mike Pence, was the governor of the state of Illinois at that time, and he refused to declare it a disaster for disaster relief. That area was 98% Black. In that same exact state, there was a community called Greentown, Indiana, that had levels of lead in their water that were significantly lower than East Chicago, Indiana, and they got immediate relief. Same governor, same state, same element, significantly different levels of severity, significantly different treatment. So it is important that we hold elected officials accountable because we all pay tax dollars. We're all supposed to be protected if the same information is supposed to give a similar response, and yet we're not.
And that's where, when I started and I talked about the loss of democracy, that we're all part of this democracy, and therefore we all should be treated fairly according to the fact that we're all here in this same arena. And when it comes down to what happened in Flint, and I grant you, in some places significantly, in some places the lead levels are much higher, but what a lot of people don't understand about Flint, what made it so significantly different, because right here in Washington, there were high lead levels in certain areas. So that wasn't what the problem was. The problem was that it was the entire city. There was nowhere you could go and get away from it. And with this one, it not only harmed people of color, but it also harmed people who were European as well. Because if they're caught in the line of action between us and them, it's going to affect them. And that's when it really became an issue that people wanted to deal with the accountability on, because it wasn't just affecting the entire African American community or Latino community, it was affecting everyone. And we have to hold people accountable and say, hey, we live in the most prestigious, well-funded country in the world. And there is no reason why in 2023 that we're having the issues that we're having related to mental health, related to lead poisoning, related to gun violence. There is no reason in the world. We are too educated for this. It's just the time is out. We're playing these numerical games with each other. But there comes a time when you have to say enough is enough. And it's time for those folks that know better, as my grandmother used to say, And she didn't have the education that most of us have. But when you know better, you do better. And it's time for America to do better. I said this once, I'm going to say it again. I said it to the EPA when they came to Flint. Let me explain something too. America's dress is up, and her panties are showing.
Okay.
And they're a little soiled. So we need to get that dress back down and change them panties.
Tell them.
Yes, America, that is what you need to do.
Look, and that is a visual like no other. You won't forget that, folks. No, but I so appreciate throughout all of you all's comments, the common thread of like accountability, right? Is that the reason it's so important for folks to be educated about lead poisoning, and the reason it's so important for us to know these statistics, to hear these things that are sort of shocking, that kind of make you want to clutch your pearls a little bit, is because that leads to necessary action. Is what do I do now in recognizing that, okay, this is an issue. Okay, I get it that it's a problem. I get that it's impacting my community at these levels and in these ways. But the next step is what do we do, and how can we connect to actually create solutions to these problems and to be a part of necessary progress. However, I think unfortunately a lot of people don't know where to start, right? Or are in a position of hopelessness or helplessness to think that there is nothing that they can do to affect their local government or their community government. Like, for a lot of folks in these low-income neighborhoods, like, I'm working all day. I don't have time to make it to a city council meeting, or I don't have time to show up and sit through all of these things, or to write 20 letters to our government officials. And to that point, there still has been no justice for the Flint water crisis. No one has served time in jail for intentionally poisoning the entire city, as you said, Dr. Bailey. And the settlement monies that have been released have not reached directly to Flint residents. So a lot of money has been poured into the community, but a lot of people are asking where it went. Like, where did money go? Where did money reside? Where did money reside? And other majority Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities that are at most risk for lead exposure, but have the least resources. Recently, the Biden-Harris administration released the Get the Lead Out program. And I think this is what you were mentioning, which prioritizes their commitment to replacing all lead service lines in the U.S. within 10 years. However, still, this plan does not have specific provisions or guidance surrounding the existing and growing public health and mental health issues that result from lead poisoning. So once again, we want to talk about the symptom of the problem, but we're not addressing the root issue that is causing these symptoms to arise, right? Also, the Environment America released a report in April 2023 that highlighted our country's school systems are largely failing to even adequately test for lead in school drinking water. So for each of our panelists, what recommendations do you have for policy at the federal, state, and local levels to best address the public health and mental health crisis at the intersection of lead poisoning? And as a follow-up to that, not only what policy recommendations do you have, but how can people locally get involved to act in their communities if they're experiencing these issues? Dr. Bailey, you want to start?
Yeah, well, I'll take that on advocacy, on how do you get involved. And for a lot of people, that's a big question. How do I get involved? And I've got limited time. I need to work and make resources for myself. I tell people, jump in and get in where you can fit in, what you can fit into your schedule. Get involved in something. Go to your local church. Start a group at home, a learning group. For me, it was to deal with the kids. You know, I'm going to give up my summer and I'm going to work with these kids. And I'm going to make sure that they understand. I'm going to work with their parents because I can do all the work in the world. The kids don't drive themselves anywhere. They don't take themselves to anything. So you've got to work with the parents that actually drive the train You got to teach them what's going on, because the homes belong to them. And if they need to be cleaning the homes a little bit better, instead of saying to the kids, you know, clean up, you know, there's some deep cleaning that you need to do in your own home. Getting involved with different groups like I said, at the church, at the local center, getting involved in those groups, starting a group of just you and a couple of other parents on the weekend that you're going to just do some cleanup, and you're going to talk to some youth. Those are some of the ways that you can get involved and get active. In terms of policies that need to be done, well, first of all, you need to give people back their right to democracy. You know, we need to stop playing this role in this game with, when it comes to communities of color, we take away democracy from them real quick. In Flint, in Memphis, and other places, Uvalde, and all these other places, that we take away the democracy that people have, that their right to choose how they're going to be governed, who's going to govern them, and what laws are going to be instituted. We need to give the power back to the people. Those are some of the policies that I don't even know if that's a policy. It's just something we just need to do. We need to look at our laws and our antiquated laws regarding drinking water, regarding air pollution. We've been doing these things to communities for years. And so we have policies. Why don't we just make the policies work? Why don't we just institute them so that they can work? I think I heard you say that before, at least, that all we need to do, you've got policies on tap. Let's just use those policies that are there already. We keep trying to reinvent a wheel that keeps us from being held accountable for what we've done. But this is going to take time. It's going to take a lot of work and a lot of effort from everybody. You can't sit on the fence on this.
Yeah, just to build off your point, Dr. Bailey, and thank you for everything you just said. But to build on your point, as we were talking before this session, we were talking about a separate but related issue, and you said you have to really understand why or how this is happening. And democracy is one of those things. I don't think people can give you your power. You just got to take it back.
Sometimes.
So that's one thing. But we really need to invest in quality housing in America. We have to invest in places that are healthy for people to live. We need to invest in healthy environments for all people, such that we're addressing lead exposure, but such that we're also creating places where people can walk and breathe and get access to healthy, high quality foods, which is something that helps if you have been exposed to lead. We need to invest in the infrastructure that creates healthier lifestyles. If that is something that America is actually holds as a priority, then we have to make that investment. That is one of the best ways to mediate lead exposure, but to also mediate the long-standing environmental and racial and economic and everything else injustice that continues to have an impact on the lives of the same people who have the highest impact from lead exposure. And I would also say that at a city and local level, it's important that we have a federal strategy for addressing lead exposure. That is where significant resources can come from, particularly financial resources. But we all live locally. We don't all live in Washington, D.C. Actually, none of us do. So it's also important that on a local level, in the midst of dealing with multifaceted issues, living multifaceted lives, that there's someone who is keenly focused on a lead strategy specifically, that we have a task force or something of that sort at the city and the local level, at the county level to focus on lead, such that the public health departments and the schools and the mayors are ensuring that this is not one thing that's a problem for people. And I would also say that this isn't a policy solution, but it is a solution. This type of conversation, just increasing awareness, helps people to now understand something that they had maybe never thought about before. I mean, to be honest, I don't think about lead on this daily basis. So, so I think that this is actually a part of the solution too, is increasing awareness.
Yes, absolutely. I love all the points that you ladies made on the panel. And so one of the things that comes to mind when I have to hear this question, Asata Shakur, one of the things that she said in regards to the implementation of Black liberation is that the number one thing someone can do is join an organization of like-minded people. And you touched on this earlier, Dr. Bailey, where organizations like Black Millennials for Flint that's doing amazing work nationally, just building the awareness, or your local church, the Environmental Defense Fund, these are organizations that are doing the work, that have infrastructure that you can come in and educate yourself and discipline yourself in what is actually going on. And I think on the local level, even on a personal note, it just increases your self-awareness within community, right? So that empowers you, that gives you advocacy, and that also gives you the education to go forth and bring about change. And then the other, on a federal note, just as what you said, we are looking for investment, which means we're looking for money in dollars to be put into a problem that we did not create. There are grant programs for homeowners to change out their pipes if necessary. There's developing grant programs, developing programs of lead prevention, and also going back to what our earlier point in regards to police brutality, and how that's affecting the youth and adults growing up with lead poisoning, really investing in the mental health and awareness when it comes to dealing with people who are affected by lead poisoning specifically, because I feel like that's a different level than just being born with or understanding, because this is something that they didn't ask for, but because the environments were not, there wasn't an initial investment in their environments, now it's kind of like, what's the word I'm looking for? Retribution in regards to how they've been treated, because again, lead poisoning and environmental racism is a white supremacy issue, and it is something that we have to call it plainly and say, look, this is what happened because you have looked at us in this way, and so this is what we need to repay. This is part of our reparations, so to speak. So really looking at it in that lens, and not just from a lens of, oh, you guys are asking, or oh, we're trying to prevent. No, this is something that was caused by white supremacy and needs to be fixed by whoever the powers may be. It's on them, again, that accountability piece. So those two options, just really getting involved in organizing, and also again holding these people accountable that caused the problem.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I think as a piggyback off of what you said regarding making sure that there's investment into these issues, which is absolutely necessary, but we also need to consider with the investment who's managing those funds, right? Because again, there was so much money donated and invested into the Flint community after the water crisis, but then years later now, so many people are still wondering, like, where did the money go, and what was it used for, and was it actually used for the benefit of the community as a whole equally, or was it used once again to systemically recognize symptoms of the problem, right? Like, America loves to throw money at an issue and beat around the bush, right? But can we go to the source? Can we go directly to the source of the problem and begin to address the systemic issues, the systemic frameworks that are continuing to cause these sorts of problems in our society, this lead epidemic that's occurring throughout our country, right? Because we can throw a Band-Aid on the issue all day and night, right? We can throw a Band-Aid on every city, we can fix the pipe in each city, and there will be another there will be another lead poisoning, right? So what we need to do, what's necessary, is that we as communities begin to recognize the root causes of these issues that are impacting our community, going back to, once again, redlining, going back to the Jim Crow era, going back to all of these different things that were placed in order to keep Black and brown communities subjugated, to keep Black and brown communities oppressed in different ways. So it's absolutely necessary that all of these things, that you find ways to get involved yourself, that you find ways to get in where you fit in, right? That you find ways to advocate for yourself and to educate yourself and to engage in important conversations to build awareness in your communities, and that investment is is made, that we hold our politicians accountable, right? All of that is necessary, right? And it's also necessary that you find your own lane, right? And recognizing that you can't do each and every one of these things, but there is something that you can do, right? There is a way that you personally can make an impact. So with that being said, look, I have more questions for y'all, but what had happened was you was dropping fire and bombs, and I couldn't get them all in, right? So with that being said, before we leave, we always like to end with our audience feeling empowered, though, and I can't leave without that happening. So give us 1 to 2 words. Like if you had to sum up everything, if they didn't hear anything else, which I always say, I hope you heard everything else, because be for real, right? But if they didn't hear anything else, 1 to 2 words that you want our audience to leave with.
Sure. 1 to 2 words. Education and accountability. That's my 1 to 2 words.
Youth empowerment, because that is the community that we really need to focus in on, who has many wonderful ideas.
Yeah, I say if you heard this talk today, tell somebody about what you learned. And if you are in Macon County, Alabama, join the Macon County Youth Council.
All right. Well, with that being said, thank you all so much for joining us for another episode, another hybrid episode of the Green Table Talk. You can catch us right back here for the last episode of the season on the 4th Thursday of June at 6 p.m. Hope you tune in, and we'll see you there. All right.